I'm June Reith.
And I'm Kyle Thompson.
And you're listening to General Intellect Unit. And this time we are reading an article called Agile and the Long Crisis of Software by Miriam Posner, which was published in March of 2022 in Logic magazine. It's a rather fun little article that kind of goes over the history of Agile as a software development management methodology, but specifically looks at it from this angle of management discipline and labor discipline, I guess, and the various attempts of management and capital to impose its will on the workers. Refreshing,
yes,
refreshing kind of perspective.
Yeah. It's kind of akin to, of course, the Graeber article, flying cars and the falling rate of profit, but
yeah,
it comes at it more from the angle of this specific labor process and this specific set of workers and this specific, of course, ideology of Agile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's just such a nice take as well, because I come from the software world, and Agile is just the fucking water you swim in there. And this is not the kind of article you're going to get in Wired magazine or something. This is the kind of thing that only gets published in Logic, you know. So I just like having these takes on this sort of stuff. So Kyle, have you been exposed to Agile in any practical way?
Yeah, let me think. Yes, I have. I worked in an Agile workplace when I was doing video games journalism.
Right.
Yeah. So that was that was the whole thing. It was, all Trello boards and everything like that.
Oh shit. So this thing it's contaminated other industries. It's not just a software thing anymore.
Yes. Yes. Though I think it is, it does have a certain orientation towards delivering a very particular kind of service. That means that it hasn't spread to every part of the economy.
Yeah, I guess not. But I don't know. It's an interesting kind of angle, and it's an interesting it's kind of reminded me that impression that there's that old saying that software was eating the world or whatever, and I think in many ways the practices of the tech industry and the way things are done there has also started to colonize the rest of the world in really weird ways, and in part by the fact that we now export our tools
yes, exactly,
to everywhere else. Every lawyers are using Git now for some fucking reason, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's the main thing is the availability of these tools and the sort of way that everybody has been habituated to turning to a online tool set for organization means that these things sort of slowly filter down or filter out to non-tech organizations. And also, of course, these tech organizations have enormous bureaucracies that work with them. And so through those bureaucracies and people's working experiences there, but also sort of trade conferences, all that kind of stuff, these practices do spread out to other bureaucracies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Through osmosis, or through that thing where ants vomit in each other's mouths to communicate or whatever. That's how that happens in the business world.
Yeah, that's what cons are. Yeah. Cons and work meetups. Yeah.
It's trophylaxis for MBAs. Yeah. Oh shit, I don't know.
Yeah.
That's
yeah.
Anyway, the article kicks off with the author's kind of first encounter with Agile, working at a library, and the software developers that worked there had these really impressive kind of this impressive set of terminology about user stories and stand-ups and sprints and all this kind of fucking cool stuff, and they seemed to be able to deliver things really fast, and they were adaptive. If there was some kind of a roadblock or some kind of kind of problem, they were like, yeah, fine, whatever, we'll deal with it, and they'd route around it. All very very cool. And what they were doing was agile. This new cool way of doing things that was designed for speed and flexibility. And the thing they note very early on is that like it's oriented around developers breaking down tasks into these tiny units, and then chewing through them as fast as possible, and doing this very adaptive sort of process of like feedback and deep engagement with their stakeholders and all that cool stuff, right? Which then leads the author to kind of like dig into the history of Agile. What the hell is this thing, and where did it come from?
Yeah, I mean, beer isn't mentioned in this history, but you can definitely see where his work was influential on the people who came up with this stuff. Like in terms of his emphasis on sort of continuous planning, as opposed to staged planning, which I guess is more the waterfall paradigm, like the sort of 5-year plan paradigm. Um, there's obviously things in Agile that were not adapted from beer, like, and also things that like they missed that are very important for sort of like beer's conception of viability. But yeah, you can, I've heard that like in the valley, it wasn't that uncommon to sort of see some of beer's work lying around. And I would be very surprised if the people who came up with Agile hadn't read him.
Yeah, there's a suspicious similarity, and there's glaring omissions as well, which I guess we can talk over later. But Agile, once you become familiar with Beer and his cybernetics, like Agile starts to strike you as like baby's first cybernetics. It's like this kind of like it's a kind of, yeah, it's an attempt to start on some of this kind of stuff, but then like it does have some pretty big holes in it that and then like I guess the thing with the piece is that like these attempts to get kind of like worker autonomy by doing this style of like management can't really pan out because the ultimate kind of autonomy or the authority is still reserved by management anyway, so that autonomy is always curtailed, and that's the fatal kind of thing from a Berian perspective, I guess. That's why you need revolution.
Yeah, I mean, it also has some other problems that we'll probably get to as we talk through this. But yeah, the history of Agile.
Yeah, the history of this long slap fight between engineers and management, and there's a thing that kind of note like that. It's a kind of story of like management like desperately trying to wrangle and tame the processes of software development, which turn out to be kind of untamable, and there's all kinds of attempts by management to impose order on a kind of basically like kind of highly unordered sort of process, because like one of the problems with software engineering is often that like you're usually doing something quite new, because if you're not doing something new, it's already been automated and you just reuse the automation. Like and like in some instances, like if you're doing, I don't know, if you're working at like a WordPress consultancy sort of thing, maybe you're doing basically the same drag and drop sort of stuff day in, day out, but like it's more common to just actually automate things. And so in software development and like developing these kinds of products, you're often kind of just tripping over new problems kind of and like unforeseen things fairly constantly, which kind of it scuppers a lot of these attempts to formalize everything and to have management be able to like specify everything down to the last iota. And that's what eventually kind of steers towards Agile of like, well, we have to adaptively deal with these kind of things. But even then, the desire still remains, right? Like managers are still managers. They still want that kind of like, they still have that psychotic investment in that kind of control.
Yes. And I think a lot of software development is new stuff, but it's actually like, it's true you can automate away specific tasks once a set of code has been created, but a lot of what developers do is kind of like almost, how would I say this? Like, it's sort of like brokerage work. where like you have all of these code bases and agendas that are constantly shifting, and you're the person who has to like translate and reconcile between them. Um, and because like this constant change is happening and it needs constant readjustment, rearticulation, retranslation, reformulation. Um, it's very unruly. Like the you can't neatly define the parameters of the problem and then expect the code that you develop to be functional, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, and like, there's a kind of another way I think to think of it that is very similar, right? That like, even if it's your fifth time as a team doing like an invoicing app or something like that, the thing is that like every time you do this, and for every different kind of like client, they have their own pile of bullshit to deal with. And so the bullshit is new every time. And so it's like, okay, this isn't my first rodeo when it comes in terms to like read some values out of a CSV file or whatever. Oh, but it turns out this isn't actually a CSV file. It's some other horseshit that a fucking mainframe
Yes.
vomited out. And you're like, oh my God, I have to combine that with this other
Yes.
bullshit, you know? And so the novelty is often not novel, but it's novelty still.
Yeah, and then it's stuff like, oh, the storage API changed, and this library did a new version which broke compatibility. So now we have to decide if we want to run on the old one or if we want to run on the new one. If we run on the new one, it means we have to refactor this and this and this. So like it's very much like keeping the ship of Theseus going.
Yes, exactly right. And you can see why a certain degree of agility would be necessary for that kind of task, and why trying to plan out the entire process while the ship is in dock, yeah, may not actually work, you know. But let's get on to the some of the first sections here. Turning weirdos into engineers, in which the author kind of goes over this like. It goes back to the 50s when there was kind of an awareness of like a kind of a crisis in software. Like, and this kind of gets to some of the title here, the long crisis of software. It turns out this whole field has just been crisis after crisis all the way through. But there was an early sort of crisis in like the lack of trained programmers and like the kind of awareness that there just aren't enough of these people around to make this industry actually work.
Yeah, it was because they came at it from this perspective of like once the um electronics, mechanical, and systems engineers had done their jobs, the programming should be trivial. Right? Like it should be like, oh, okay, you know, all the systems have been planned out, the fundamentals are working, so you kind of just, you know, the computer does exactly what you tell it to do. So you just, you know, write it down and run it, and that's it. The hard part is making the machine and the systems engineering, right? Not the coding.
Yeah,
Uh,
it was secretarial work, you know. That's how it was seen.
exactly. Like I'm surprised the article didn't mention that, but this is why it was women's work. Yeah, because it was seen in the same vein as secretarial work. It was like a work of transcription is how it was conceived, right?
It wasn't creative work at all. It wasn't even engineering work. It was just secretarial work. You know, women be coding, you know, as we all know. And so that's why it's kind of funny when, like, I don't know, people are kind of amazed that, like, oh, you know, Admiral Grace Hopper and this kind of stuff, or like that a lot of the early pioneers were women. It's like, yeah, because it was not seen as very fucking, like, enticing work, you know, it was relegated to being women's work.
Yes,
You know?
exactly.
But then that whole fucking paradigm ran aground on the fact that it's actually really hard to develop software because it is actually intellectually demanding, and that like transcription paradigm just doesn't work out. You know, it's so in my field we call that a load bearing should, like that it should be easy to do this. And it's like yeah, let me kick the sword out from under that. You know,
Yeah.
and so but that like it's interesting to see this go back so far, that like the intellectual demands of this work like baffled management in those days and still baffle management today. Like managers today still don't know why you're telling them that it'll take a month to do that. You know, they just have no instinctive kind of, but like, you know, another engineer will be like, oh yeah, of course that's going to be a bullshit kind of task, you know, and it's going to spiral out of control and go nuts, you know. But you know, so this is a constant right through this, that like the conflict between the workers and management, and the like, as I said, the kind of psychotic desire of management to control everything and kind of specify everything down to the last iota is one of these long running tensions in the industry.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so we kind of like skip over the whole part where like women were pushed out of the industry, and we get to sort of this next era of computer labor, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely right. Like it's the long haired weirdos era of like, which again is kind of framed in this terms of like that the, you know, electronic data processing was getting to be very important for businesses, and of course the suits like hated the computer guys, you know, who kind of kept.
We're all talking about you know, being all watched over by machines of loving grace.
Yeah, exactly right. And, yeah, it's yeah, it's that right kind of time frame, right? Yeah, that resentment is really deep there, and like there's then this kind of push to like management really wants developers to stop being so fucking weird, you know, and to like not like, because at this point like you have this admission that the act of developing software is much more of an art than it is a science, and there's this kind of like expressive quality and an almost poetic kind of quality to the way software development is dealt with here. Like it's the kind of golden age of Unix weirdness and shit like that. But they really want to knock that out of them. So this is where the term software engineer is invented, right? Like it's stealing valor from civil engineering and from mechanical and electronic engineering, and trying to apply it, just trying to paint it onto the task of software. And
yeah, it's very much like one of those ideological mislabelings, like the computer science department or the software engineer, you know, like basically labeling these things aspirationally. Like we wish this was like engineering. We wish this was like a science, so that it could be law-like and therefore easier to simplify. Yeah.
yeah. I kind of yeah, it's a real clear kind of imposition from above and from outside, right? Because, and you can still kind of detect this in a lot of the writing on software engineering, that like, or you know, software development, that like you have that kind of split between, you know, the thing is called the computer science department, but then you go in there and the terminology they use is like Turing's revolver and shit like that. You know, just like these very poetic metaphors and like weird kind of like concepts that are like core to the supposedly scientific, or like, you know, Church's basilisk or whatever, this kind of fucking crazy stuff. Like you know, there's a big split there, and like they really try hard to make it kind of live up to this engineering thing, which, I mean, spoiler, in the end doesn't work out. And we even today have this big split, this kind of big like split of like, what should we call ourselves? And like, there's most, even if your official title is software engineer, like for most programmers, they're like, we're not fucking engineers, you know, it's just not the right name for what we do, you know.
Yeah, not really, not at all. I think it's. I remember like talking to people in the CS department back when I was in university, and like they very much did succeed in giving them the engineer mindset. But I think that was probably at the expense of making them like good coders.
Yeah, definitely right. Actually, hold on. So, have you ever read Disciplined Minds by Schmidt?
No,
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 that's
no.
fucking excellent, and I think we need to read it for the show at some point. But like the kind of gist of the book is that like education and like professionalization kind of like takes in people and filters them and chews them up, and so that like it kind of selects for, and it either tries to mold you or like select for like traits like assignable curiosity, you know, where like the subject is creative and curious but in a very assignable kind of way that they can kind of be dictated to, and that the creative like free spirited weirdos get filtered out and get ejected from the process. And that, you know, he goes into how this ties in with capital and like military industrial complexes and all that kind of shit, but like it's a very, this article reminded me a lot of Disciplined Minds. That's a really
Yeah, that
great
makes
book.
a lot of sense. Totally.
Yeah, we should probably read that. That's a really good book. But in the meantime, yeah, so like at this point in history, that like they're trying to impose order on the black art of programming. Like the black art of programming has to make way for the science of software engineering. Um, I mean, yeah, have a go, but like it ain't gonna work. This is where waterfall comes into it, right? Because it's the kind of management methodology that suits this kind of software engineering mindset and this attempt, right? We're
Yeah, it's like I mean, it's kind of not a coincidence that like sort of the paradigm for waterfall working is like NASA software development, because this is really built on like the ideas of like constructing a massive ship, or some kind of enormous machine, is sort of the paradigm that they're working in here. And so it just so happens that it does actually work reasonably well for building a massive ship, but most software does not work to build massive ships. Yeah.
Yeah, because like I mean, if you're building a space rocket, like there's kind of like there's a definitive launch point, and everything has to be done before then, and there's no real room for learning as you go along, like as the Challenger thing proves.
Yeah, and sort of learning as you go is not really an option,
Not
right?
an option at all, right? And necessarily then there's this huge like hierarchical kind of like attempt to plan fucking everything down to the last iota and get every subsystem aligned with every other subsystem. And I mean, yeah, you get to launch a spaceship, it's great, but one of the problems with software is that like often you're not building something that has a definitive launch like that. You're often building something that needs constant iteration anyway. Even if there is like a launch, you're going to want to be iterating on it after the fact. And then the interface between a space rocket and its environment is actually quite slim, right? Like it interfaces with four people, the crew. It interfaces with a single physical system, which is the atmosphere, and then it interfaces with gravity. Like there's not much it actually interfaces with, but if you're building a software system that's used by a lot of people and is used in many contexts, its like surface area is huge. Like its contact with the world is enormous, and that kind of means that like, you know, because you can do ballistics and like pin down the exact behaviors of a spaceship because it has so little going on, like that's tractable. But then trying to plan out the ultimate invoicing system that's going to be used by hundreds of thousands of people, you just don't have enough information at the start to know what the best kind of outcome actually is. And so, yeah, there's just incongruences there right from the start that means that this way of doing things can't really work out.
Yeah, and so the thing that management really wanted here was to have managers who would be like the officers, and then they would just give orders to the software engineers, and the engineers would just do what they were told.
Exactly. It's like
So there
Borg
was,
style fascism where like, you know, the Borg drones are just fucking drones, but like the Borg queen is a real person who gets to decide things and issue orders.
they wanted to maintain that distinction between the office and the shop floor, right? Yeah.
That was the drive. It was I mean, for all the bullshit they'll kind of spin, but like, oh, it's actually the best way to do things. It's the best way to. It's just fucking labor discipline. Like that's all it boils down to. Um, yeah.
Yeah, like it is a organizational logic, but if you think about it for 5 minutes, it's really not a very appropriate one. Yeah, it's only something that could really be appealing to managers or to people who are just sort of enamored with the idea of a kind of like, yeah, Borg like, you know, specified social order.
Yeah, like when we read the Norbert Wiener, he kind of did he draws a distinction between human beings and ants, right? Like, but he sees that some human beings really want humans to be ants because of that desire for control, and that's what's going on here. Like, it's this pathological desire for a different kind of species, frankly. Because like ants are basically 3D printed little robots that don't really have much variation amongst themselves, but human beings are extremely complex nervous systems with, explosive variety, and that like fascist desire for absolute control, and that desire for people to be Borg-like or to be ant-like is this kind of just design. It's an actual like it's a hatred for humanity itself, really. That we
Yeah, totally.
the so with this in place, then like the industry, it just keeps hitting crisis after crisis, right? Like one of them is that there just aren't enough like people being qualified in this like strict engineer kind of role to actually fill out the ranks that are needed, right? Like that
Yeah, because the labor demand for this job is just like it's out of control. It just keeps growing and growing and growing because like essentially the whole thing about tech is taking sectors of the economy, colonizing them, and replacing everything you can with software. And so that's incredibly labor intensive to like, observe an area, find out how it could be turned into software, make it make it usable, maintain it, and distribute it, right?
oh, hugely, right? And you need fleets of fucking developers to like actually build the thing, and so like the qualification stuff just wasn't keeping up with this. In parallel, you have like the problem that stems from that thing you described, where software was eating the world. It was starting to just consume more and more of the economy. That the scale had changed, right? Like in the 1950s and 1960s, like you're building these like they're quoting from someone here, but like you're building tiny log cabins in the 60s, but then by the 80s you're building huge office buildings equivalent in programming, and then by the 90s it's skyscrapers. The sheer scale of the task had changed, and like productivity had accelerated as well. So like it was tractable for teams like larger teams to take on larger and larger, like by orders of magnitude size projects. But then the nature of the game starts to change there, because like in the 60s you might have a program that reads in a couple of lines of data from some file, and it's relatively well structured, and it like does some math and then spits out a couple of numbers, right? Like back in the day, it was novel to get anything done. Like printing something to a screen was a 6-month kind of like research project. But once you're over that kind of stuff, like you start to get to things like, oh well, I want this gargantuan fucking mainframe system to process transactions in real time in a bank and do all kinds of crazy shit, and it also has to send its data to all these other terminals, and like that's just a whole other order of complexity. And so the horizon of complexity just seems to keep receding into the distance. Like you kind of never really get control over the thing, because once you've gotten control over the task that you were happy with in the 60s, like shit's moved on, guy. You gotta keep going. You gotta keep that complexity treadmill going, because those tasks became trivial. Because like if you think of like you use like of Linux or something like that, like all of the baseline programs in that thing, like the even shit like fucking Bash or HTOP or whatever, those were serious engineering efforts to make those work in the first place. And then like, but they're trivial by now. it's all crazy AI stuff these days in distributed systems. So, the management's trying to get everything under control while the actual task itself was spiraling out of control.
Yeah. And of course they were making money hand over fist, doing it. So there was this demand to find more and more things to turn into software.
Yeah. And like waterfall just didn't keep up with any of these things, right? Like this all outstripped the possibility of like waterfall. The waterfall methodology, it became more and more evident that it was getting in the way more than it was helping by this point, like in the 90s. Which brings us to the 2000s. 2001, you get the Agile Manifesto from a bunch of, like, the section is called khakis and dad jeans, which is, yeah, exactly right. Like it's a bunch of middle-aged white guys in dad jeans obsessing over management in a hotel somewhere, and they come up with this wonderful new kind of way of doing software development called Agile.
Yes.
Who were like, by 2001 it was just really obvious that this shit wasn't working out. And as you said earlier, they must have been absorbing some, like, Berian kind of stuff, or like Babies for Cybernetics, because like what they come up with does resemble that, in a pretty serious way.
Yeah. Like if you read what they say, right, it's like, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others do it. It's like, okay, yeah, like learning by doing, helping others to do it. Okay. Through this work, we have come to value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. It's like, oh, yeah, okay. It's kind of like gets to the sort of like Burian autonomy vibe, and like the focus on system two interactions, working software over comprehensive documentation. Again, it's sort of like that sort of like purpose of the system is what it does kind of mentality of like, well, if your purpose is to produce documentation, you're probably not doing the thing, right? You should have working software. Uh, Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. That seems like a different thing. And I mean, it is like a system one thing, but that seems like a different sort of field. Although I guess the collaboration thing is cybernetic in the sense of like being receptive to your environment, right? It's the kind of like system four stuff.
Yeah, that's what they kind of mean. I think that like they would rather talk directly to the customer and figure out what they need rather than rely on contract negotiators to figure out what the spec is.
Yes, yeah, and
They want that direct collaboration.
yes, and then responding to change over following a plan, which is like 100% that like Burian focus on continuous planning, sensitivity to the environment, adaptation, all that kind of stuff. Um, yeah, it's like that is. Sorry, they say finally that is, well, there is value in the items on the right. We value the items on the left more. So these are our priorities. Yeah.
Yeah, and this was a huge challenge to these kind of like the evident failures of waterfall, right? That like instead of following management's plan, the carefully constructed plan, you kind of chuck that and go for like kind of sketchy roadmaps, and but then emphasizing like direct contact with the problem and making decisions on the fly rather than having everything planned out from the beginning. Big emphasis on adaptability, and I get like there's a huge emphasis on just like close contact. Like it's high fidelity, close contact with the thing you're making and the people you're making it for.
Yeah, I think about this mentality very much like contrasting with sort of like the BSD mentality, especially this focus on documentation, right? Like working software over comprehensive documentation, because like the BSD people are like obsessed with documentation quality, and they also are like very much obsessed with this idea of like specifying a sort of perfect operating system and then like maintaining it. Uh, and yet, like it doesn't really get used very much.
Yeah, I mean, this ultimately gets kind of this ties in with that like worse is better notion, right? Like, or the cathedral versus the bazaar, right? Like, where on the one hand you have the perfectly crystalline, planned out like cathedral, like it's going to be fucking magnificent once it's done, but either it never gets finished or it does get finished and nobody gives a shit, like because it's not actually useful. Versus the bazaar, which is the kind of like just swarming kind of mass of like human intelligence that just assembles something from out of nothing. And the worse is better being that contrast between, yeah, the software paradigms that win out tend to be these like scrappy, half-working implementations that are useful enough to actually be useful, versus like the kind of technically better, the Betamax versions that are like, yeah, they're technically superior, but like nobody cares, or like they're too late coming into the game to actually be useful to anyone. For all kinds of reasons, the kind of Darwinian process of these things seems to tilt in favor of these worse is better solutions. And like, yeah, there's a lot of that here as well, right? Like it's that kind of scrappiness and adaptability seem to win out over big plans.
Yeah, and it's like people sort of like have a fascination with like BSD as like, wow, what a incredible effort, what an incredible thing it is to be so obsessed with maintaining its form and being very obsessed with its form and the the aesthetics of it, and the sort of like engineering principles that are brought to it. But like, it's kind of, you can have that appreciation from afar without actually really doing anything with it.
Yeah, like who actually runs BSD these days? You know what I mean? Like nobody. Your fucking Wi-Fi card's not going to work if you install that shit.
I think the PlayStation 4 operating system was a hack of BSD
You're quite right. It was.
because it's a permissive license it's under, right? Yeah, so but that's like very much like, we're making an appliance. This is an appropriate operating system for an appliance, right?
Yeah, it's not going to be receiving constant crazy updates from all over the internet. It's going to be yeah, that like platonic notion of it does fit much better.
It's like it receives a lot of updates, but the thing is, its spec doesn't really change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's not getting like patches from like random contributors on like fucking the Linux kernel or whatever. Like that very different philosophy. Yeah.
Nobody's expecting your PlayStation to be the brains behind a microwave all of a sudden, right? Like, it's a games console with very specific functions, and it's just going to do those things better over the course of its lifespan.
Yeah, exactly. But why do better when you can do worse is better over the course of your lifespan?
And I also am 100% certain that the software developers at Sony did not follow the principles of BSD when developing the operating system after they had downloaded the code base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they just unzipped it and got to work, right? Like,
Yeah, it's like, okay, let's get hacking.
They're not going to contribute back to the cathedral that way. But the author here notes that this whole agile thing is very visibly like the frustrations of professional engineers, right? Like, but these frustrations are not manifesting in like a demand for a union or anything along those lines. It's just a couple of concessions to allow them to work more efficiently. I wanna do my boss's work even better. They're not like aligned against their boss here. Like, even though like the frustration is with their bosses, they're not aligned against them as such.
Yeah, the focus isn't on, I want to do work for my boss better. It's, I want to do the work better. There's a kind of fetishization in like the Marxist sense where like the art and the craft of coding becomes ideologically separated from the environment in which it happens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
and the ends to which it is put, right?
It's a dedication to the mission, that kind of thing is like
Yes, yes.
the mission above all else. Whatever the mission happens to be, that's what I'm dedicated to.
Yeah, and so it's about like being the best craftsperson you can be, and having the best tools, using the best methods, working with the best people. Uh, that's the sort of mentality which has no necessary opposition. Like it has an opposition to management, but it has no necessary opposition to commodity production.
Yes, precisely. And it's a weirdly like accelerationist kind of position where they're asking management to take the brakes off so that they can go faster and deliver harder and that kind of thing, right? Like where
Yes.
the strictures of the management paradigm are restraining the forces of production, and you really want to unleash that bad boy.
Yeah, that's really the key thing with Agile, right? Because you don't see that mentality in a lot of craft work. Like it's if it's an artisan making like blown glass or like wooden tables or like hand blacksmithing hooks or whatever, uh there is an inherent resistance towards speed up, and a focus on just like I do the thing the way that feels right to me, and maybe it could be sped up. There's a certain standard of productivity that I need to meet in order to get myself fed, but it's not a part of the ethos, right? The ethos is more about slow work and all that kind of stuff. Now, uh, in Agile, because iteration, and breaking down barriers is seen as in like conducive to the craft, it becomes aestheticized in a way it doesn't in most craft work.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally. Right. This kind of thing could only really have happened in high technology and computing, right? Like in and around the 90s, right? Like that's just that like that general kind of like libidinal Landian fucking pulse that was through that industry. Like it had to have been there and then, rather than anywhere else.
Yeah, yeah, I think it had to be networked, and it had to be like service driven. I think are the key things there, right? Because like service driven means that the ends are constantly changing, and networked means that like flow becomes a positive value, a source of pleasure.
Yeah. So I think that's definitely true, but it like we kind of get there through a hop and a skip, right? Like where this, so it's 2001 where the Agile Manifesto comes out, and this is like just around the kind of .com crash or whatever, and then it doesn't entirely catch on until the 2010s, because management is obviously resistant to this kind of stuff, and like in the
That like that is true, but it does catch on in the people who are like among the people who are students in the early aughts, right? So those people aren't in the workforce yet. They haven't like actually managed to change the culture yet, but they are. There is like a growth in that period of time, and then it starts to become mainstream, right? In the
Yeah,
2010s.
there's like a kind of echo bounce to it where like you can see how Agile suits the moment of 2001, and you can see how it got there. But then it's in the 2010s when you get to like the explosion of like venture capital funded software ventures, and like the kind of recovery from the .com crash, like, and you get this acceleration again, right? And now you've got proper high speed internet, which wasn't quite there in the early 2000s. You've got venture capital money. You've got this, I don't know, just reconstitution of this like new high risk, high reward, move fast and break things, computerized economy. That's really when Agile like settles into its groove and gets really gets going. It becomes a common sense by then, you know.
Yeah, I think I kind of associate it with like that period where JavaScript sort of became everything.
It's the Ruby on Rails era and the early JavaScript.
Yeah, right. Sorry. Yeah, that would, yes, exactly. Yes. And then subsequently the JavaScript frameworks are everything era. Yeah.
Right. So it really comes into its own in the era when, you know, GitHub is being built on the back of Ruby on Rails, and like JavaScript stuff is becoming a thing. And there's a moment there, you know, there's a really ephemeral kind of moment that like continuously mutates from there, but like you can see it sort of starting to bed in there.
Yeah, and then you have like the rise of like boot camps and sort of like alternative ways of expanding the labor force outside of the engineering paradigm in universities.
And I think it becomes I think the reason it starts, one of the reasons it starts to take off in the 2010s and with the VC backing stuff, is that there is this tilt towards services rather than products. Because like 2001, you're still dealing a lot with boxed software being sold in stores for Windows, whatever. 2010s, you're talking much more of these like subscription based services. Like it's everything's going through the web browser now.
Yeah, and then there's like the so-called like Web 2.0 period in between there, where it's sort of transition from one to the other.
And I think Agile finds itself being more suited to the latter, even though it sort of began in the era of, because like in the manifesto and the principles, they still talk about like delivering software products. You know, it's still in that kind of mindset of like there's going to be a launch, maybe with some iteration, but there's and the project is going to have a defined kind of start and end date. Even though it's not the waterfall thing, it still kind of has this like, it has these terminal points. And that it actually is better suited to the continuous, ongoing, subscription-based, service-based kind of computer stuff that comes along a bit later. So it finds its groove in that. There's also some notes here on that, like the kind of like culture or the mindset that goes along with this. Like you have like Wired magazine, you know, to the 2010s version, and this kind of like, you know, free thinking, non-conformist like notion of like of the programmer, right? This is real dude bro programmer shit, you know.
Very libertarian.
Yeah, meritocracy. Like this is the fucking stuff that they're all about, right? And it's like, it's an anti-management stance, but it's not in any way anti-corporate. And in this way, it's kind of funny, right? Because it kind of struck me is that's like, as much as I hate the kind of like PMC term, this is a kind of intra-PMC warfare that's being conducted, you know, which you know, there's like a kind of a professional strata is like, you know, sticking its heels into the management strata and stuff. Like there's a real kind of like I don't know, there's something kind of funny going on there, as much as I think the whole PMC concept is kind of crap.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's unusual only in the sense that like had some success. Because like if you go like
It
into any
that's the weird thing.
if you go into any professional setting or let's say craft setting, the workers are going to complain about management and consider them to be a impediment to their jobs, right? But in this case, this grievance became a ideology and a method and actually changed the corporate culture to some degree, which is something you usually don't see.
I think the thing that makes the difference here seems to be that it was also very evident that the way things were done wasn't actually working, and then the venture capitalists are pouring money into these ventures really needed to actually deliver, and it seemed probably by accident that Agile was actually delivering, and that there was a kind of an actual like revolution in the systems of production sort of thing going on here that like but without that, it it wouldn't have succeeded. Like I think it needed the buy-in, because like basically like the VC money would deliberately chase these small scrappy startups doing agile for investment, and wouldn't even fucking touch a Sun or an Oracle. Like no way are we gonna sully ourselves with that kind of stuff. Without that productivity boost and that kind of like revolution in the system of production or whatever, it would have been dead on its ass. Like
Yeah. I don't think it's so much an issue of working or not working. Because there have been so many things VCs have invested in that like don't really work per se. Uh, but it's the importance of like getting something to market, creating capturing mind space, uh, being able to pivot, like that, transferring from a pitch to something that can attract investment and like maintain a constant presence, I think is really key to why Agile is attractive over Waterfall. Because there's plenty of industries where things don't work and they could conceivably be better, but why in this one did people care enough to actually change the methods of work as opposed to just doing what everybody else does and suffering with bureaucratic dysfunction?
yeah, so was it just that the moment demanded speed, and that agile was it even if it was worse than waterfall on any number of metrics, it was faster, and that was the thing that was important to VCs.
Yeah. And it may produce better software. I'm just saying that there are so many there's so many places that skilled people work in where there is very little translation from a problem with methods to a change in methods because the inertia is so strong. Yeah.
And for management to tolerate this kind of thing, like this like really serious threat to their authority, the payoff had to have been pretty serious. But management gets their revenge ultimately, right? Like we kind of, even with agile, we still fall into the same old tar pits, right? Like it's still pretty fucking hard to actually develop stuff. Agile also suffers from some particular pathologies where it's because we break things down into these very small, like micro tickets, and then focus on speed. It can be very easy to get lost and kind of miss the big picture, like you get kind of missing the wood for the trees or whatever. And projects kind of run aground in a different way now, where you just have this like sandstorm of tiny particles of like work units, but like there's no coherence to the overall thing.
Yeah, nobody actually knows what they're doing. Like it as a collective aim, right? They're just kind of like identifying problems and solving them without actually thinking where they're going, right? Is the criticism here.
And it can amount to a kind of organizational lobotomy in some ways, that like you can kind of end up with like not really a kind of zombie process that is good at churning through this like pile of chicken feed little tickets or whatever, but is not actually producing anything coherent in the end. So there's plenty of discontent about agile, right? Like that it's not really as liberatory as an experience as was promised, and like I don't know, like in qualitatively there's not much of a difference between like the Sisyphean task of like working on some waterfall thing versus the Sisyphean task of like shoveling this fucking pile of gravel from one place to another, which is what working in an agile kind of environment often feels like, where you're kind of losing the sense of like what the hell you're actually doing, and instead focusing on these tiny pebbles that are just fucking everywhere and you have to deal with them all the time. There's also a lot of problems here of like this. Agile has become this like agile industrial complex. Like there's no shortage of like consultants who are trying to fucking come in and fleece you for training and all this kind of shit about like something that was supposed to be a very lightweight thing. Like it was, you look at the manifesto and the principles, there's not much there, you know, and you can probably figure out how to apply them. But like, you know, the the kind of like methodologies that get called agile, like Scrum and all this kind of stuff, are often they're often much heavier than the waterfall methodologies they were replacing.
Yeah, at least as a sort of like system to kind of like operational principles thing. It's much more like, oh, you have to inculcate like this whole mindset about how to work, and then there's so much communication around the work that becomes its own kind of complexity, right? Whereas like, you know, your manager coming and saying, like very much in the way that like video games are developed, right? I need you to make this axe, right? Like this axe asset. Make axe assets for 50 days. That is your specification. You know, go do it. It's much simpler than, you know, being in an agile system where you're creating micro tickets, fixing all these things, you know, having stand-ups, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
You got to have a check-in meeting about the exact shape of the axe, and like, you know, that imperative way of doing things can kind of feel like there's more honor in that way of working rather than like debasing yourself by talking about the fucking task constantly. You know, there's you can get a lot of resentment out of that kind of process. You can kind of actually crave a more straightforward and imperative kind of mode of working, actually, which is kind of weird. It's kind of like that kind of gets to a thing here that it's kind of demeaning, like, you know, and it when you describe this kind of stuff, it like it's other professionals find this demeaning. Like there's a thing here where the author talks about like describing a stand-up to a lawyer friend, and they were just like stunned. It's like, why would you put up with that shit? Like, you know, why not treat each other like human beings? Like it felt like to other professionals this seems like an insane way to behave yourselves. And a lot of the problems here kind of ultimately fall down to like, this is a thing that takes the shape of the container it's poured into, in part because Agile is kind of underspecified, and like it's inevitably poured into these hierarchical corporate structures, and so it takes on the shape of that container. And so that the problem of the imposition of management and all this kind of stuff, it doesn't disappear at all. In fact, it reappears in all these kind of ways that, like, you know, stand-ups as a form of labor discipline and surveillance, story points as a kind of bootleg Taylorism, which, you know, give me the real version. At least there's some sort of fucking, like, there's some respect in that, but look, don't give me the bootleg version of Taylorism, you know?
Yeah, it's very much that, like, it's kind of like Soviet ideology in the sense that it's like it has the formal structure of workers' liberation, but at the same time it doesn't have the substance, right? And like everything is kind of like said in bad faith. Um, where it's like, oh yes, we'll all be, you know, self-organized and agile, but by that we mean actually, you're going to be assigned a PM, and they're going to manage this agile process, and you are expected to display participation in the management without actually making any substantial decisions.
Absolutely right. And like in so many cases, like the kind of product management layer predictably like has all the kind of like again that Borg Queen sort of style of like creative autonomy and like deciding what the product is and gets to do the design and all that kind of stuff. And then as developers, you're kind of just reduced to like drone like kind of following of these like these plans that are handed down from above. So it definitely still resembles it. Like, it's not an accident that it still resembles the waterfall kind of structure, because it's the same corporate structure. It's the same mode of production. Like, that's going to happen one way or the other. One of the kind of differences now, I guess, is that like in the early days, like the 2000s, 2010s, Agile was being taken up by self-organizing teams. of workers, but today Agile is always imposed from above by management. And that's got to get you thinking, right? Like, if the management is so keen on this thing, why is that, right? Because they have found their way to, impose control. Like, I don't know, like, I mean, you could ask a lot of developers and they'd tell you they'd prefer not to do this agile shit. Like, they'd welcome a break from this kind of stuff, but it's demanded by their superiors.
Yeah, because it reminds me a lot actually of like masking if you're neurodivergent, right? Because like you have to put on a mask of being a participatory member of your workplace. You have to like sort of publicly perform for everyone else a state of mobilization and intelligence when there's no substance to that. So faking it is more exhausting than doing it.
Absolutely, right? And like, this kind of reminded me of a thing, like, so earlier in the piece they mentioned, like, in the 90s kind of framing, they mentioned like films like Office Space or whatever, where you have like the disaffected programmers working in the kind of waterfall framework. I think you could just reshoot that film today, but with Agile as the backdrop, and it wouldn't change the substance of it in any way. you know yeah, it would be largely the same film.
Yeah, they would probably just be richer.
They would be a bit richer. Yeah, they would have a bit more.
That's pretty much it.
A bit more of that Silicon Valley kind of like cachet to them. But that's got to tell you something, right? That like they're just in substance, for your experience as a worker, there just hasn't really been any change. And yeah, it turns out there are serious limits to this kind of autonomy and creativity that's promised by this thing. And like you have the freedom, quotes freedom, to pick any stone from this pile of gravel, but you don't have the freedom to really participate in the design of the pile of gravel or like question why or what the fuck you're doing. It's it's very much in line with that assignable curiosity concept from Disciplined Minds.
Yeah, that's the ideal Agile developer, right? Is like the person who is enthusiastic, has assignable curiosity, and doesn't like think twice about the structure they're involved in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the article kind of concludes with some of these things, right? The kind of brewing next crisis in software, in the long string of crises, and it's a lot of this kind of stuff, right? Like this huge skepticism about this freedom promised by Agile. In practice, a lot of folks just don't act like have fairly long careers of actually working this way, and they just don't like it at all. Really, at the end of it all. There's also some interesting points here about like the role of Agile in like toxic workplace cultures, like that there's a notable lack of diversity in who formulated this thing, and like you can kind of see the gaps where like, if you're somebody who's in any way sensitive to these kind of things, that like it's kind of obvious how this would be applied for like bullying and discrimination in the workplace, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of these sort of like specific techniques they mention, like pair programming, can be unsafe, right? Because it's this isolated social circumstance, and it's one of those things where it's like it can be quite high tension because
it feels like being on a fucking chain gang,
Yeah, you're like under surveillance all the time, right? And then there's like like they say here, these retrospectives are similar to struggle sessions. It's very like very cult like in that sense, right? Where it's like, oh, I must confess my sins. Like this imposed confession, very sort of Catholic, but you don't even get the dignity of having it in a private booth.
You don't get the cool aesthetics either, so what's the fucking point, It's the only cool thing about Catholicism.
That's right. You don't get that weird massive sculpture that Pope Francis was sitting in front of the other day.
Oh, you gotta love that shit. It's so cool.
It's okay. I just expect From Software to appropriate the aesthetics for me and then recycle it into a commodified secular form. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. Code review is also a huge fucking problem in many ways. Like, I mean, like, tune into any of this kind of like women in tech stuff or like being a person of color in tech, and this will come up over and over again. That like of code review being this way for the fucking bro dudes to show off and tear down their colleagues, and like it's a kind of thing you just have to fucking endure. And like there's a wonderful point here that like eliminating bureaucracy, hierarchy, and documentation can feel good, but it feels good until you're a person who needs those rules for protection. Like bureaucracy and hierarchy and process and stuff like that. It's kind of can be a kind of maybe not the hierarchy part, but like some sort of organizational structure. And limits to the kind of move fast and break things mentality can be pretty essential. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's hierarchy in the Buryan sense, right? Like just
Yeah, the functional hierarchies.
yeah, it's like yeah, you kind of need that in order to account for variety, and if you don't account for that variety, then people are going to use ad hoc solutions like just rampantly bullying people who are different because they don't understand them and feel like they can take advantage of them, which they often can.
Yeah, absolutely. And like what a wonderful kind of historical double echo where like women found the kind of the foundations of computing, and then were chucked out because you don't want these broads having that kind of power. And then a couple of decades later, you're back in that kind of thing where it's just fucking intolerable to be a woman in this kind of industry in most workplaces.
Yeah, and by saying like this hierarchy can be protective of people who need it, we're not in any way saying that HR is a good thing, because they're almost always narcs. So
Yeah, HR is your enemy, but there's definitely a toxicity that comes out when you take a bunch of dude bros and you tell them, hey, look, you're empowered engineers now. You can just fucking do your own thing autonomously and move fast and break things. Meritocracy, all that kind of crap goes with it. It's the libertarian mindset that got jammed onto this thing that's more of the problem, more so than like the agile stuff itself so much. I mean, although like looking at some of these methodologies, like as a woman or a person of color or whatever, you can kind of see stuff that the people writing it might not see. But also the thing here in this paragraph is about the roles that this stuff has played in these toxic cultures, and like the libertarian bullshit mindset is the other half of the equation there. There's also some fun calling out of like the roles that this probably played in like infamous failures in the tech industry. So like Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica scandal, all these kind of scandals over like ethics in tech versus move fast and break things. The like pathological design of social media, it's you can kind of see how that might fall out of an agile process.
yeah, I thought a lot about, or I thought recently about this sort of thing where
Sorry, I just love the way you just like contrasted thinking a lot about something versus thinking recently.
sorry,
It's quite wonderful.
I was thinking like I guess what I would say is I wasn't thinking a lot, but I was thinking deeply for a shorter period of time recently, and I confused intensity with quantity was the problem there.
These are the two modes of thought.
Yeah, that's right. Uh, but yeah, I was thinking about this conversation I had with my friend one time where I was like, he was like, well, what is your specific plan for communism if you think communism is a good solution to the social problems we have now? And I was sort of like, well, you can't really like specify this kind of thing in detail in advance because it'll never work. Like you really need to kind of like adapt, and yes, you need to get your principles down. Yes, you need to like do your research on sort of prior art, prior examples, and you need to understand your situation. But you can't be like, here is my grand utopia. I have designed it down in every little detail, and I will now implement it. That's just ridiculous, right? Um, and he was like, well, he was like, that's absurd. Like, why would anyone do communism if you can't give them a plan that will reassure them? And then I was like, yeah, but like tech basically did that for like 30 years, like just kind of had social license to fuck up any part of society they wanted to because they were like the vanguard of progress. Um, so like it's it's not that the like that objection to communism isn't really substantive. It's more just like I don't buy into the libidinal investment in this project, right? Yeah.
And like, yeah, it comes from a kind of assumption that um, like the world as and like capital as we experience it now is not already a vortex of anarchic fucking insanity, and that like the process of communization might well actually be much more sober and well thought out than the kind of shit we have to endure.
Yeah, maybe.
Maybe, hopefully, but like,
I would hope so.
but it's a total inversion, right? Like and it's a kind of like, do people not see the just devastation and chaos around them today? Like by what fucking yardstick are they measuring this thing? It's crazy.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like it's like, oh, but that's just how move fast and break things works. It's clearly all for the good, right?
Yeah, I find it's a very interesting split, right? In that like um yeah, like I kind of, obviously in the concept of revolution there's the the big break and this kind of like high variety kind of process that goes on, but the thing that it's in service of is actually kind of um like humane order and like peace, like not in the service of like endless destruction. But like that's the thing we're stuck with, is this like machine that just continuously fucking destroys things, but its operation is taken to just be natural and unremarkable. And the prospect of like human beings like seizing control of history and imposing peace on ourselves would actually, it seems insane to some people for some fucking reason. So yeah, I mean, it's easy to draw that through line between like Agile and its like Landian imperative to remove the brakes on the process of production, and just like allow it to accelerate and move fast and break things, and like the kind of, yeah, the chaotic structures of technology that we actually use, and the kind of general chaos in society it seems to have caused. And then this only gets worse with machine learning and shit like that.
Yeah, like having no real concern for implications of actions or why you're doing something uh is very like consistent with the logic of capital.
Yeah, like, because we've been saying that like in Agile you get kind of lost in the details and you kind of lose the big picture and you're kind of enslaved to these small details, but that actually might, like, for this kind of technological capital, might be a strategy actually, that like its way of freeing itself is to lobotomize itself in this way, that like there's kind of reference here to these like chains of deniability, in that like at every point on the assembly line nobody is taking full responsibility for what the team is creating. That's very clear in Agile, but it gets even worse when you mix in like machine learning and shit like that, where it's like it goes from a chain of deniability to like a smokescreen, where the operation of the thing is just completely obscured behind this like cloud of small tickets and things like that. And you gotta, like, that has to be, it's adaptive for these systems. It's not adaptive for us as a society, but these systems seem to thrive on being able to deploy these smokescreens.
Yeah, and even if you look at like the VCs who are kind of like the brains that are coordinating these investments, they have the deniability of like I'm hands off. Like I just provide the money. I just look for profit. Like I'm not the one who's actually doing Cambridge Analytica, um, and so on. It's that thing that's just like characteristic of our contemporary society as a whole, where like there's a lot of sense that power is completely distributed and responsibility is nowhere.
Yeah, that's it. I think that's really interesting, and I think we don't take the concept of deniability and disavowal seriously enough as like a functional adaptation in these systems. That like there's something to be gained from doing that, from playing dumb.
It's very important to have people like go along to get along. Having some amount of ability to engage in deniability and disavowal is important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess where I'm going with that is that like when we see this, and we see these kind of like structures of deniability and disavowal, we have to recognize them as being somehow adaptive for that system and for those people. Like there's a reason they latched onto this. It might even not be a conscious reason, but like there's something about it in the kind of Darwinian pressure cooker of capital that like forces the thing this way, and builds these things into the system. That's the systems that survive.
Yeah. And the obsession with method and craft over like awareness or judgment is also just like very conducive to this approach to life.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, oh, if I'm just optimizing things all the time, then like I never actually have to think about what I'm doing, where I'm doing it, whom I'm affecting, and so on.
Who I'm doing it to.
Yeah.
And then, with all that said, then the article does kind of close off on a sort of semi-positive note that like the concepts behind Agile still kind of have this potential to foster solidarity among workers, right? Like because we can still in this disappointment and disillusionment with how Agile actually turned out, we can still point back to self-organization, open communication and worker organization, and that kind of like hostility to management. It's just that like this iteration actually didn't work out for us, and we need to turn our hearts to the gospels of beer and Marx instead.
Yeah, like I don't think that responding to these failings by demanding to be dominated more openly and explicitly is something that people,
like we want waterfall again, that kind of shit.
yeah, exactly, or like is essentially something like it, like, well, we're not going to have project managers anymore. We're going to have disciplinarians go around.
Project commissars,
Yeah, we'll have people's commissars who will go around and do this work. I guess probably in software studios in China, they probably literally do have commissars in the company at Tencent. Yeah, working there.
Or like TikTok, is ran by the fucking military or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. Anyway, yeah, I just don't think people are going to demand direct domination in that way. So that means that like the ways forward are fairly constrained in what they might be in terms of looking for a better way of working. You kind of need substantive liberation, or I don't know, like I just can't see like as long, like I guess the other thing would just be to like utterly break the power of software developers so that they do labor exactly like management originally wanted them to, don't have any say in the matter, as opposed to having this like fictitious participation that is providing ideological cover that allows the machine to run.
I kind of think like that. As much as we can point out the problems of Agile, it does seem to be still working out for management. Like it's in a crisis from our perspective, but it doesn't seem to be in a terminal crisis from the perspective of like the companies. And so I don't know that there's much like because like waterfall and that kind of shit ran aground on it actually sucking and being really bad at delivering things, but like these machines seem to actually kind of be more or less working. I mean, like, we still have these problems that, like, software development's really difficult. It's still hard to tame this complexity. Even with Agile, it's still really difficult for it to get it under control. But, like, until there's, like, a crisis in that like, productive space, like, until there's a make or break moment similar to that make or break moment between Waterfall and Agile, I kind of don't know that there's going to be much room for a big change there, unless there's like a revolutionary transition, in which case like yeah, it's going to happen one way or the other. But in the absence of that, I don't know that the managers need to change very much to like appease anyone. Maybe it's just like this boost just grinds on your head forever, and the Agile is just the long now of the way things are done, and you just kind of accept the discipline at some point.
I think there's like a sort of broader ideological project or imaginary that facilitates the functioning of Agile, and sort of like with the tech lash, that kind of stuff, it does kind of weaken its grip in a way because people are much less likely to be true believers. Right, you get into that kind of like late Soviet phase of people just like,
Going through the motions.
like they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work kind of cynicism. Uh, uh, so yeah, I mean that is, I think, undermining it to some degree. But yeah, of course, you don't get workers' autonomy without like workers organizing, without labor essentially changing the situation. It's not going to be management that changes it because, like open source or like Agile, it is actually beneficial for them.
Yeah, definitely. And like, kind of like situating this historically, like it's kind of easy to see how for like in the 90s workers organizing was or like in the 90s and 2000s workers organizing was off the fucking table entirely. Like the Berlin Wall was down, Soviet Union was fucking gone. You can kind of understand how things went this way, but like we're back in a very different historical moment now where workers organizing is back on the table in a big way. I mean, it's not, we don't yet have a serious kind of workers movement, but like the percolations are visible there. And also like all of this other shit from the 90s has run out of steam in a big way. So it's, I mean, fucking workers even in tech are turning to unionizing, which is a big change. Like that's the big thing there, that like the Agile folks never fucking thought for a moment that trying to pursue a union was even remotely fucking viable. Like I would wager it never entered their heads, because that's crazy talk in fucking 2001. But in 2022, it's not crazy talk anymore.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the work has become so much more ubiquitous and common. It's just not the same as it was in the 90s, where it was a bit more of a niche thing, and a bit more like it was easier to imagine yourself in that libertarian mode that drove the whole agile revolution.
It was a very elite thing, certainly, and it's much more proletarianized by now. And I mean, it's not the bottom of the ladder by any stretch, but it's definitely much more of a normal sort of thing, and just doesn't. Yeah, that's a big change too, right? Like that, you don't have quite so much of the same, or at least like compared, like if you take like the bulk of software developers and count them up, like you get comparatively less of the kind of labor aristocracy sort of tier in there. Like they're outnumbered quite a bit now by just like proles who happen to, edit code in Vim all day, Yeah, I don't know. I thought this was a fun article. Do we have much else to say about it?
I don't think so. I mean, I think, as you said, we could maybe follow up on it with this sort of talk about disciplining creativity. But I think, yeah, it's a nice intro to the subject. Although it does sort of elide the whole like exclusion of women from the entire industry chapter of the history, which I thought was a little bit shocking, but because it is like directly pertinent to why or how this thing played out. But yeah, I think it's good to sort of like check back in with these things that talk about like specific processes or methods or practices in tech, and how they relate to the broader happenings that we're in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's good stuff. I like Logic Magazine. That's a good magazine. Everyone should go check it out. They have a lot of this kind of stuff in it, which is very refreshing. And I don't know, you don't get a lot of this. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe it's more of a thing now to do this kind of tech criticism from the left sort of stuff, but I don't know, like I'm very acclimated to just not having any of that available. So it feels surprising to me, perhaps, even though it shouldn't.
Yeah, and I mean, like, blogging isn't as much of a thing as it used to be. And so this kind of like essay format stuff, as opposed to like Twitter threads or YouTube video essays, is a little bit unusual. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. God, I miss blogs. They were cool. I miss like reading things that were not generated by the sort of bizarre like vortex of crazy shit that is Twitter, or like Twitter threads and stuff like that, and just I don't know. There's something about the contemporary internet that's just like very different on a tactile kind of level, and like it seems to hit your brain very differently.
Yeah, it's very opening the water hose and just like blasting concepts and images at you, as opposed to that sort of front to back article format.
Mm-hmm. Anyway, I should probably just quit the internet and commit myself to only reading PDFs of magazines that are sent to my inbox this time.
I will have my PDFs delivered over Usenet. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
No web interactions. I will log in with my Usenet client and download them.
Oh fuck. But yeah, thanks listeners for coming along with us on this this little journey. It's good to be back after summer break. We've got some stuff planned out for the rest of the year, so it's going to be a bit of fun. While you wait for the next episode, you can visit our website, generalintellectunit.net. You can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook and we're on all the podcast apps. So do the subscription thing. Subscribe and download some other episodes. I think this one will be episode 91, which is pretty shocking. We've a big back catalogue. If you're just joining us for now, like there's a lot of shit back there. It's largely good. I actually I scrolled through the fucking archive a couple of weeks ago, and I was just like, wow, I don't remember half of this. Like conversations I've completely forgotten. And I was surprised there was so much of it. I guess that's the thing. Is like 91 is a pretty high number.
I guess we should do something for number 100.
Yeah, I don't know. Like what the fuck would we do? It would, because we could either do something very I don't know. We could do like we do something you'd expect somehow, like something that would make sense. Or we could read volume 2 of Schwang or something like that, like fucking completely out there. Just get into like the history of capitalist accumulation in China for some reason, and make it insufferable for episode 100. I don't know. We should think about that. Like, what do we want to do for the 100?
I'm not very good at throwing parties for myself, so I'll have to give it some thought.
Yeah. Let's see if anything comes to the surface. I'll give it some thought. We could just have get the whole Emancipation gang on a fucking like Zoom call and just drink and like just talk shit about whatever. Record that for a couple of hours.
Yeah, or we could record something live while I'm in Europe, if it's possible.
Oh shit, maybe. Yeah, let's look into that. That could be fun if we're not dealing with like energy blackouts and shit like that in this winter.
Yeah. It's like, so we began. It's like we are recording this in the bunker. And it's strange to think back that we began recording this show in the before times.
Yeah, the long before times.
Yeah.
Back when there was fuel. Oh shit. Yeah, I don't know. While you wait for us to figure that out as well, you can check out our sister shows on the Emancipation Network. If you go to emancipation.network, you can find the links from there. There's some absolutely fabulous shows there. From Alpha to Omega, Mortal Science, Swampside Chats, and Jumpsuit Utopia. They are fantastic.
I'll also just give a shout out to my new game, Dragons and Travelers Tales, which will be available on itch. If you just look for Dragons and Travelers Tales in Google, you can find it. And it is a tabletop RPG for 2 people. It's very much based on all of the cybernetic ideas that we've come up with on this show. That was heavily informed the design. I would say it's not explicitly there, but it is definitely implicitly there. So yeah, it's about, using cybernetics to make a game that is a framework for world building and character creation. You essentially play with each other and together make a world, fill it with characters, and get these little like fantasy story chapters that are about personal growth and that kind of stuff. So yeah, it is coming out on I believe September 15th. So yeah, check it out, please.
Very nice. I was going to ask if you did like use cybernetics or whatever to do it, but like yeah, that actually sounds really cool. Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it was very much like thinking about, okay, like, what is the interaction between these people in this particular role? How does it contribute to the broader system? Like, what is the flow between the different phases of play? How are these different phases like changing the way that people operate and relate to each other, and how does this all sort of fit together into a big process that is ultimately sort of focused on, yeah, like a better world and growing as a person as you play the game, about growing as a person. It's very recursive in that sense.
Yeah, there we go. Fantastic. God, that does sound cool. Yeah, absolutely check that out. That does sound that sounds phenomenal. Yeah, can't wait to get my hands on it.
It's pretty good. I would say it's pretty good. I think it's one of the best things I've written. Yeah.
Fantastic. Very good. Yeah, I don't know. Do we have anything else?
Oh yeah. From Alpha to Omega, we've started recording the Understanding Class series again. So I don't think it's really the releases have really been interrupted that much because Tom has such a massive podcast backlog. But yeah, it's going again. We're getting through it. So if you want to go check out that show, I am on there still.
That is an excellent show. And I've been enjoying those episodes as they've been coming out. Yeah, well worth checking out. Yeah, so I think that's probably it. In which case, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll catch you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.